Okay, welcome everyone to our policy discussion. And it's a special kind of policy discussion tonight because all week we've been discussing academic research and maybe how it relates to policy. Well, tonight we're going to be talking about how we can make sure that economic research becomes part of the policy discussion. How does that happen? What is the best way in which that can happen? How can it go right? Maybe how can it go wrong as well? So we've got two of the biggest experts that you could imagine about that. First of all, from the UK, Paul Johnson, who's the director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which for half a century has been leading that policy debate and interpreting policy, analysing policy, for the media, bring it to the public. Paul, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Yep. I think that's justified when you see how much effort Paul puts into it day to day. And so Paul's equivalent in France, I suppose, Antoine Bozio, has set up the IPP. It's been going for about 10 years now on the same model and has attempted to do the same job here. Pretty hard work as well, isn't it, Antoine? Because there have been some policies that have been slightly controversial during that time.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. So we'll be discussing all of that, I hope, in the next hour. If you want to ask a question, I mean, what we've done before is we talked for ages, and then I said, do you want to ask any questions? It just occurred to me that actually if you want to ask a question, you can go like this to me, and I will see you, and then the mic will find you. We can do that. Otherwise, we'll wait until we stop and we'll ask for questions. Whatever way you want to do it, it's fine. What I want to, first of all, I want to ask you, Paul, why is it important that you have something like the IFS, an institute, to be able to bring this conversation forward instead of leaving it to individual academics?
I think it's quite different actually having an independent institute than being part of a university economics department. I think it makes a difference in a number of ways. The first is that as an institute we have institutional culture, knowledge, memory. So the models and data and so on that we work with were started by people, a generation or two back, and they're fed on through the organisation. So it's not just about individuals, it really is about an institution. That's different from the role that individual academics can play. Individual academics clearly can play a role in their very specific areas of expertise, or if they are really pushing the boundaries forward in particular areas, but are unlikely to have all of the institutional background that we have. A second part is to do with incentives. Clearly, in academic economics, the prime objective is to be publishing in top journals. Well, we publish in top journals, and that is a significant part of our objective. And we work with academics, but also for staff at the IFS, equally weighted is the communication with policymakers and the publication of things in newspapers and blogs and so on in order to have an impact. And that's just not true within university departments. And I think the third thing, in terms of being an institution or an institute, is that my colleagues don't have academic freedom. They can't say what they want. And that means that journalists and politicians can trust and know what they're going to get from anyone at the IFS. I mean, we are there to provide, as far as we can, objective, neutral, independent analysis based on our understanding of the data and so on. Whereas you pick a random academic, you don't know necessarily what you're going to get. Even within the very best departments, there will be those who want to push one particular view or another. And that's the role of academics, that's the role of academia. And it would be very dangerous not to have that freedom. But I can be much more of an autocrat than a head of department can be in an economics department.
Antoine, are you an autocrat?
Don't think so, no. But what I can see in Paul's point, which is really true, is the fact that as an institute, you can create and build analysis over years by investing into tools, into data analysis, then will be useful in a very timely manner, which is very difficult to do by an individual. So we have teams that work and that developed basically models that can be used. They will take years to be built in, and then they can be used on a daily basis, depending on the social demand or the subject that is discussed in the news or is asked by policymakers. And I think only institutes that actually can plan that ahead and can do these investments over a long period of time can actually achieve that.
You're in the process of building trust in what you do. And that's very important, isn't it? Where does that trust come from?
So when we started our IPP, basically my aim goal was to achieve something what I saw at IFS to be described in the press as the respected IFS. And basically being able to have, each time IFS is presented in the news, it says it's coming from the respected IFS. So how do we achieve that? And basically that was my main goal to try to do for IPP at the end, to be able to see that. So how do we achieve that? The way I understood that is we need to be able to be very serious about trying to be impartial, that is trying to not fall on one side or the other, trying to be clear about the objectives can be very different, political objectives. Our job is to try to describe what are the impact of different policies to reach these objectives, not making a judgment on these objectives. And a few months or years ago, I could see, and our communication officer mentioned the fact that now in France, the press were describing IPP as le très sérieux IPP, which I found a pretty good translation to the very respected IFS.
Paul, how do you get respect?
Yeah, it's a very important question, and trust is really, really important, and respect is really important. I think it's about how you do things and how you do them over a period of time and how you do them consistently. So part of it, in terms of working with the media, is just being helpful. So we have lots of people who will call us and ask questions. Some of them are often rather silly questions, but we will tend to be helpful and make.
Listen, I'm a journalist. There's a number of silly questions I've asked. That's what we do.
And we make time for that. That is part of what we see our role as being. We are very careful about what we say. So we try very hard not to make mistakes, and we try very hard not to say things in a sensationalist way or in a way that pushes the facts or the beyond where they can easily sit. And part of it is just a thing about time. I mean, the longer you've been at it, the longer you have to build up relationships, to build up a reputation, and to therefore gain that trust and respect. But it's always, I think it's worth saying, it's always a little bit fragile. You don't need to make many mistakes to throw away a long period of building of trust. And I can think of institutions in the UK where that has happened, where people have gone too far and have lost institutional trust. I think the last thing I'd say is the internal culture is incredibly important. So the way that we hire, train, work with staff, their expectations and the behaviours they see and exhibit are just vital to it. And it's going back again to this importance of an institution. And within an institution, an institutional culture is really, really important.
But importantly, you can't be the person that says on the one hand and on the other hand. You have to take a position at some point. For example, last year there was disastrous budget in the UK. You took a position on it, and that was quite a strong position.
Yeah, I mean, when you see really silly things happening, actually part of being independent and objective and so on is to say that.
It sounded political at the time to some people.
Well,
didn't
it does. I mean, there's no getting away from sounding political at times, because you're saying that the consequence of doing X, and X has been done, is is bad. I mean, it was. I mean, we were quite strong before the so-called mini budget last autumn about the potential consequences, and we were very much justified in saying that by what happened as a result, and that made us unpopular in some parts of the press. But I do think there's a difference between being independent is not the same as not saying things as they are, and I think you have to pick your fights, and you have to be careful about when you're going to do that. But you can't just sit back and say, well, on the one hand it was a sensible budget, but on the other hand the economy crashed. I mean, it's kind of it's,
Antoine, there's quite serious consequences to some of the political decisions that happened in the last couple of years. Does that ever put you off taking a position on any of these policies?
So in order to appear independent and to build that credibility, we have to be able to not shy away from publishing policy reports or briefing notes that might disturb or might get some sort of disturbing reaction. I think what has been my sort of aim, and I've been prudent with that, is to try to make sure that we were solid enough each time we were publishing something that could lead to that disturbance. I think that in a sense, over the years, given we're very young and not as established an IFS, we have grown in sort of credibility, which makes all communication now even more important than they were at the beginning, where we were sort of an unknown institute. And I think that now we are even more cautious about trying to make sure we are correct. And which basically also means that we need to put in even more effort into checking, rechecking, trying to reach a point where when we end up in the publication stage, we are on very sound basis for saying what would be said.
Paul, if you reserve the right to annoy anyone based on the fact that you've done the research and this is what you found, where do you get your money from, and how careful do you have to be about where you get your money from?
Yeah, we are. Again, we're pretty careful about our finances, and I mean, one of the challenges is that the range of places that money is available from is quite limited. So about just under half of our money comes in one way or another from the UK research councils, economic and social research councils, where we are effectively competing with the university economics departments and social science departments for funding for projects. Other key funders are, broadly speaking, big charitable foundations who fund research. There are not very many of them, though, and that gives us quite a narrow funding base certainly for our UK-based work. We have probably 3 or 4, no, less than that, 2 or 3% of our income comes from corporate donations, so very small fraction that's untied in that sense. We do not take money for any kind of consultancy. We would not take money from a company that wanted us to sort of say something about alcohol taxes being too high, or business rates being too high, or what have you. It's absolutely vital that we are completely independent in our funding. So that really does bring risks, because as I say, the range of funders is limited. Despite how careful we are, the one time we've got criticised for it was around the Brexit referendum, because we are and work with the very top academics, they were getting European Research Council funding. Now, we always thought that's about the cleanest money you can have, because that is academic money that's gone through a top-level refereeing process. But of course, and on the Brexit referendum, it was one of the more difficult things we worked in. The economics, in our view, was pretty straightforward, and so we said that the economics was pretty straightforward, and we got accused of saying it because supposedly we were corrupted by the fact that we were getting money from the European Research Council. So in a sense, however careful you are, you will end up being attacked. But I think nevertheless it is important to be extremely careful.
It's a shame that, because otherwise the Brexit debate was very measured and polite, wasn't it? Antoine, where do you get your money from?
So we get the first sort of layers of funding comes from actually from PSE and from CREST, so two sort of leading research and teaching institutes. But that represents a small fraction of the total budget, because most of our funding comes from responding for calls for research, and so we get funding from research agency, we get funding from the different ministries who commission research, from different organizations like Social Security. Overall, we get perhaps too much of our funding through very short-term sort of research project compared to the type of funding that IFS gets in terms of more the SRC center, more permanent level of funding. And I think we would like to argue that we should go in that direction of having a more balanced view between sort of contracted funding for different research projects and to have funding necessary to invest. And as Paul was saying earlier, it's necessary to be able to answer in a timely manner, to have investment in different models, in data analysis, to be able, when there is a need for it, to use that work to be able to provide timely answers.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that timely manner, because there is, I would imagine, a trade-off between the amount of depth and precision that you can go into, but against the news cycle, which moves on fairly quickly, and you have to be responding to that news cycle. And I think it's something that a lot of academics struggle with and would like to be able to give a quicker answer, but would have to say, I don't know yet, I'll get back to you next week. And that just doesn't work. What are the tips for pulling it off? How do you do it? And do you ever go into an interview thinking, I don't really know quite enough about this? Paul?
I'm not sure I want to admit that, but to a degree, there is always a trade-off between how deep you go and how quickly you do things. But I think a large part of the answer is that again, you build up the expertise. So if we have questions on the impact of a student loan policy, or the impact of a tax change, or the impact of a welfare change, we will tend, A, to know the background, B, to have the data and models there up and ready and running, as it were, and therefore able to do more than pretty much anyone else really very quickly at a level which is really quite useful to the debate. And actually, one wants to be careful about this, but equally, I think one does need to recognise that even when you don't know as much as you'd like to know, you probably know, you definitely know more than 99.9% of the viewers, and with all due respect, probably 95% of the journalists who are asking the questions. And often that's enough, actually.
Yeah. Yes. How do you handle this, Antoine?
So in terms of responding to the news, to be able to answer to questions that are timely, I think it all depends on previous research. I don't think we rarely do really on the night some really new piece of research to respond to a demand, except when budgets come up, and that's a specific question. But mostly, I think all main issues with that is we are commissioned to evaluate a policy. We do the work. The government is very keen to know the answer. Is it working? Is it not working? And we get first answers, which are often, well, the first types of results of the short-term answers, which might not be actually the long-term answer, which is very important as academics and as generally in terms of understanding the impact of the policy. So we need to be careful in being able to point out that this is what we find, but perhaps there are other pieces of work or the part of the literature that points that maybe the impact on the longer run could be bigger, and we still need to wait to get the fuller picture of the impact of that policy. But there still needs to be an answer that is provided as what we know yet, because we can't just delay for years the answers, as policymakers need to make decisions, need to scrap the policy or continue the policy. So we need to tell, as the best of our knowledge now, what do we know?
When you go public with opinions, do you get do you get feedback from people who decided that you don't know enough, you don't know what you're talking about?
It happens, yes. So depending on the different viewpoints and approaches, economics, I think, has a certain approach to try to deal with certain issues and to understand how taxes impact. Incidence of taxes is not completely straightforward. If you talk to lawyers, they have a very different view. Who pays these taxes? Because they think it's written in the law, and we need to say, well, our view is that, the markets react to these changes, and we can document that. So sometimes there are some different viewpoints which are hard to reconcile, but as soon as we feel we are aligned with what, the literature and how our peers will evaluate our work in terms of academic production, I think we're comfortable to try to make a statement that can disturb some areas.
Paul, do you often get told you don't know what you're talking about?
At home a lot. I mean, not an enormous amount. I mean, there are a range of areas of the kind that Antoine was referring to. I mean, sometimes I think it's really interesting. We work quite a lot with lawyers. Lawyers and economists think very differently about some of these things, and actually, you can some of that's quite useful. Occasionally we get things from members of the public, usually older members of the public, who object when you point out that not every old person is poor. And then there are people from a more serious point of view, as it were, who will object to for example, in the UK context, we've had big debates about the extent to which control of government deficits has been important over the last 15 years or so, and there's been quite a lot of debate about that. We've tried very much to say, given that this is what the government's objective is, this is how well they're going to achieve that. But we've been under pressure from some groups to say, look, you should be clear that deficits can be higher, and we've been pressure from other groups who are saying, actually, you should be much clearer that it's really important to get these deficits under control. And I think in that area there's been a lot of controversy, and we've been caught in some of that controversy. So there are clearly points where more serious people and other economists will disagree, if not with the detail of what we say, then perhaps with the tone of it.
Does it bother you that you are sometimes in competition for space in the media with think tanks? So as a journalist, I know that if I was asked to write an article about how the health service should be privatized, I could go to the Adam Smith Institute and they would give me a professor of economics who would say that the health service should be privatized. And if I wanted to say that should be no minimum wage, then the Institute of Economic Affairs would say there should. But if I wanted to say there should be universal basic income, then the New Economics Foundation would tell me that as well. And so I can go shopping for opinions.
Yeah.
Rather than the slightly more difficult thing of having to get in contact with you and find out what the data says. Does it bother you that those people get room?
It doesn't bother me when people are quoted with views, so long as it's clear where those views are coming from, and that they are politically aligned, as it were. It does bother me when people are quoted either as the expert in something, and the expert is saying something which I mean, basically any of the things you said.
Yeah. And there's hundreds more, aren't there?
Which don't make an enormous amount of sense. And the thing that I think I find most difficult is when journalists want to, as it were, put us in conflict with someone who's got a different view. And again, thinking back to the Brexit referendum, there were a very, very, very small number of very politically motivated economists who were arguing that Brexit would be great for the economy.
I can think of one.
I can, indeed, exactly, a very small number.
Yeah.
And this very small number, one, was essentially put up as half the economics profession, and getting into debates around that and seeing that sort of thing portrayed as if it were, a 50-50. Some people think that, some people think the other, and the IFS think this, but here's someone who thinks something different. That I found very frustrating.
Yes, yeah. Well, but Patrick Minford is a frustrating economist at all levels. Antoine, do you have this same problem, this same pain?
Yes, in a sense. I mean, very often think tanks that are very clear partisan view or political viewpoint are presented as equal in the same way as us or other sort of...
I'm not saying I do it, but they're very easy to... If you want to generate a quick feature, it's very easy to do it with their
I
help.
understand very well now why this is a lot easier for journalists. When you think about trying to create a debate, you are sure that you're asking two people will have contradicting views because you know ex ante what those views are. Whereas you come up with someone like us, he will try to have this balanced view, which is, it doesn't make great TV in a sense to have, subtle and balanced view as it's very clear political fight that can appear, and if you can add some idea that they have credentials, they are specialists, expert, and they have different views, it sounds like it's more entertaining. I think we need to find a way to be entertaining but correct and objective.
Well, there's the challenge.
That is a challenge. How do you deal with things that are a bit way out? So I just mentioned universal basic income. A couple of days ago, we were on this platform talking about a wealth tax as the way forward. And these are things that aren't really in the mainstream policy discussion at the moment. They could be in 10 years' time, for example, probably not before. Are they things that you can deal with because you have to focus on really what's here now, and what mostly are small changes to what's here now?
So on our side, we don't shy away from trying to take seriously different proposals, and the fact that they can have very big sort of issues, in implementations and so on. I don't think it's an argument not to look at them in a very serious way, because in a sense, I find on the contrary that selecting too much what you find is appropriate policy can lead to a very biased view. We don't know. Let's look very carefully and seriously at the different options that could be on the table, and without any prior. This is how in a sense, academic research should approach any subject, and I think we should try to be also put aside or prior, even if it's prior from the profession, from the literature. Let's take that seriously. Let's come into costings, into behavioral response, trying to document these, and then that will feed the debate. That would help also people who are supporting these proposals to try to adapt their proposal to what we learn. I think we should not shy away from...
Could possibly make them more politically feasible.
Yes, because sometimes there's specific issues that make them completely infeasible, but perhaps changing a number of these features can make them actually a lot more feasible on certain grounds, changing their costs, changing the way they can be applied. I think trying to be relatively open and not have too many priors about what is the optimal policy is something which strengthens our position to be independent and without any sort of political bias.
Yeah, I think I broadly agree with that. I mean, the two examples that you give, we've done quite a lot of work on wealth taxes, actually. I think it's a really interesting set of questions there. I think it's, in a sense, one of the things that worries me. We can go so far with things like wealth taxes, and then in the end, particularly if you're talking about wealth taxes on really rich people, I kind of feel there comes a point at which you really do need a lawyer. There's a limit to how much economists can say about that. Is there a lawyer in the room? On universal basic income, again, we've done work on that, and I think there are some very straightforward points that one can make about that in terms of the trade-offs. Again, yes, you can give everyone a universal basic income. And it gets rid of the extremely high marginal tax rates you have with the means-tested system, but it creates really pretty high marginal tax rates for a very large number of people. And so, again, actually you can use that as quite a useful exemplification of broader points about the trade-offs that you need to make in policy.
And no questions.
Sorry, I raised my hand because I was told that we can ask questions.
Yes,
and my
indeed.
question was exactly about what's wrong with the universal basic income if it's somewhat below the level that affects incentives to work. But you already more or less answered it. But if you could give more insights, that'd be useful. Thank you.
I mean, I think broadly, so most sort of advocates, or many advocates of universal basic income, take the view that it ought to be, broadly speaking, enough to live on. If it's broadly speaking enough to live on, it's maybe 25% of average earnings, say, which is roughly where the UK basic state pension is. That, very broadly speaking, takes 25% of national income, or a very high fraction of national income, and then you need to pay for everything else on top. That begins to get very expensive, and so the point then is that you need to accept that it needs to be accompanied by very high rates of tax. And even then, even if you provided everyone in the UK, I will take the UK example, with £12,000 a year or £10,000 a year, which is where the state pension is, you'd still have to give more to an awful lot of them because they got high housing costs or lots of children or disabilities or what have you. So you wouldn't even sweep away all of the complexities of the current welfare system. So I think that's though in a sense I found that's a very useful illustration of the incredible complexity and choices and trade-offs that you have in a welfare system. Now, you can clearly make that set of decisions, and you're making the trade-off in one direction. We in the UK have taken the trade-off a long, long way in the other direction. And actually, it can be useful as long as you can stop it being a completely polarized debate and use it as a way of illustrating what the options are between those two very different opposites.
Do you have any other questions now now we're in sort of microphone moving around mode? Just checking. Yes, down here at the front. Oh, and in the middle.
Thank you. The question that I have was yes, IFS and IPP have an incentive to build trust with the people and the voters, but there's the other side of also building trust with the government in power. So the question was that what fraction of your reports really say that, well, this policy that the government had worked versus the policies that did not work, and over a period of time, do you build trust with the other side of the government that, yes, 2 years ago we said that this policy would not work, it did not, but then these other policies that really worked, this is how you could improve on. So on the other side, if the IFS and IPP is putting an effort into getting the other side on board so that policy prescriptions that you have are taken more seriously in the future.
That's an interesting question. Antoine, you go first.
Okay, very interesting question. So a lot of our work is commissioned by not the government, but by ministries or departments for evaluating specific policies. And I must say that in the majority of cases, we come with a disappointing answer, that the policy has not worked as well as expected, or when we evaluate policies from the previous government, that it was not as bad as expected. So it's never quite, it's a bit disappointing. What we try to do is try to provide an explanation about what we have learned about what has actually worked and what has not worked and the reason why it has worked, which I think is even more important than to give a positive or negative sort of viewpoint on the policy. And sometimes to try to nourish the debate, I think this is what we care about, and trying to show what we have understood about why it was working. If I have the time, I have an example that so we were commissioned by the French Senate. The French Senate, for the British here, is in the opposition. But two sides of the opposition, the left opposition and the right opposition, as the current government is in sort of center. So both the left opposition and the right opposition agreed that they want to commission us to do analysis on the work of the current government on
Yeah, I can see where that one's going to
capital taxation. But each of the sides in the French Senate had a different viewpoint about what they expected to be the commissioned work. So we did the analysis, and we looked at both when in 2013, when the socialist or left-wing government was in place, they increased taxation of dividend, and when Emmanuel Macron was elected, he decreased the capital income taxation. What we found was that in response of the increase in dividend taxation, there was a big drop in dividends, and therefore big drops in tax revenues. Really bad for the left. You know, actually the tax increases led to a loss of tax revenues. But when looking at investment of firms, nothing happened. Contrary to what the opposition was saying, this tax increase will lead to a decrease in investment, therefore really bad for growth. No, that's not the case. Investment's completely flat. Following a title of Paul Johnson, follow the money. Where's the money gone? Well, the money has gone within the firms. They have kept that in cash treasury within firms. Well, actually, so is this good for the left or the right? Well, actually, this policy has not led to a change in inequality, has not led to a change in investment, so not so bad. Well, it's been mostly optimizations from, providing dividends or leaving dividend profits within the firm. That's very interesting to nourish both sides of the debate. It doesn't tell one is right or wrong. It doesn't tell us actually what's the optimal policy. And we were very careful not to say what's the optimal policy, but clearly we could say what happened. And I think that was a very useful narrative for all parties involved to try to understand what happened.
Yeah, very interesting, terribly disappointing as well at the same time. Paul, what do you think about this?
Yeah, it's a really interesting example. I mean, actually, one of the things I think is different between IFS and IPP is we do a lot less in the way of direct evaluations for government departments or parts of the legislature, partly because they're not necessarily so interested in having their policies independently evaluated. I mean, and actually, where we did more of that, say maybe 15 years ago, when the government in office was more interested in those kinds of evaluations, and actually there has been a change. Also, I mean, another thing that has happened is that there are now a very large number of economists in government, and a lot of evaluations that may have been outsourced in the past are now done internally with uncertain levels of independence and clarity about how much trust one should put in them. So there's been a change in that sense in the UK. But coming back to the question specifically about trust between us and government and politicians, I think one thing is very clear is that even if no one else reads our reports, the civil servants in the relevant departments definitely read our reports. And the civil servants in departments definitely trust us. and we have very good relationships with people in the Treasury and in the Welfare Ministry and the Education Ministry, Health Ministry, and so on. And actually, quite a lot of our impact, I think, comes through that trust and those relationships, because our evidence is used by them in their conversations with ministers. And I also think that for most of the politicians across political parties, they do understand what our position is in the sort of spectrum of political stuff. And broadly speaking, I think trust us to say what we think is what the evidence is telling us. Now, we will certainly irritate them a lot on different sides from time to time. But actually, I think a reflection of the sort of way in which they see us is we get very, even when we're really quite outspoken about policies, we get very, very little pushback publicly or indeed privately from politicians. We don't get much in the way of direct attacks from them, and I think that's actually quite a good. There are lots of things that's wrong with sort of the way that politics works in the UK, but I think the fact that the majority, though by no means all, of our legislators still really have some respect for independent institutions is probably quite a good part of that. Clearly, that doesn't apply to everyone who has been Prime Minister recently.
Yeah, I mean, there is a huge advantage in you being stuffed with very, very good economists. I mean, one thing that you haven't said is it's pretty hard to get into the IFS as an economist. I didn't apply, but they wouldn't have taken me. And so, that creates, you can't out-argue easily IFS economists who've done their research.
Well, I hope that's true. We're quite unusual in the sense of a sort of quite an academic research-focused institution, and we take people on very early in their careers. I mean, Antoine was unusual in being taken on with a PhD. We don't do that very often. But it does fit. I mean, one of the things that worries me is that whilst, yes, we have got very, very good people and they're working with very good academics, and we've got all of the things we talked about, the institutional background and so on, it does still feel very fragile. And we've got a very small number of people working on every particular area. I mean, we have 3 or 4 people working on tax against the hundreds probably in the Revenue Department and the Treasury. We've got maybe half a dozen people working on welfare. I think there are 500 economists working in the Social Security Department on welfare. So we're very, very thin. And I think people are often surprised by how few people we have working in particular areas. And that does make the whole thing feel sort of more on edge than perhaps it seems from the outside. So whilst I sort of appreciate what you say about sort of the power of having good people, it nevertheless, and often people will stay for a good period of time, but I'm really quite old by IFS standards. I mean, there aren't very many people there who have got a lot of experience. So it feels more fragile than you were describing it.
Okay, my window's closed anyway. Anyway, so good. Next question.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you, because it's a real pleasure hearing you. I had 2 questions, so for both of you, maybe also.
I've got nothing to say.
Well, first of all, my question is about the link between the Policy Institute, so the IFS or the IPP, and medias, because I think that it's very interesting to see. Well, I'm going to speak more about French because I have some figures, but I know that today, if you ask to an average French, namely someone who doesn't do economics, in which media does he look for information about economics, it won't be the answer. I'm sorry, I think won't be the IPP, and I say that, but I like very much and I read it as a student, but I think that you will have other answers, such as BFM TV Business, which is very, very famous on the TV, or alternative economics. And so I think that it's very important. Well, it's I think I want to understand what's your link as an institute, a policy institute, with the medias, because I think when you can read some ups of institute policies in the medias, but if there is no information from the media, how can you touch? Can you be able to allow people to know the information that you publish? So that's my first question. And my second question, it was about the debate of the objectivity and neutrality as a policy institute, because what's very interesting is that to some very complex questions, the answer is not yes or no. I think that it's very interesting to see, for instance, if we say like, is the minimum wage a hindrance for unemployment? We can't say yes or no, because there is a list of criteria. The sample is very important, the internal validity is very important, and if I use a fuzzy regression discontinuity, I will not have the same answer than if I use another method, but that we cannot explain.
Yeah, guarantee that's not getting into the press. Yeah. That's not going to make the evening news. No, but it's a really good question. Yeah.
And so, yes, my question is, how can you mitigate these issues when the question is very complex?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Really good questions, and the two are actually quite closely related, of course, because the second is really about communicating with the press. On the first, you're absolutely right. I mean, very few people in the UK would come to if they've got an economics question, they're not going to come to the IFS website. They'll go to the BBC or one of the newspapers or what have you. And that's why actually our relationships with the media are incredibly important. And we have, I mean, it comes back to what we were talking about earlier. Having trust is important. Having relationships is important. So actually knowing who the people on the various newspapers and at the BBC are, being able to communicate with them clearly through press releases, but also through talking to them, being willing to give up your time to spend time with them is really important. So all of those things and building that relationship is important. And the purpose is exactly the purpose you describe. The purpose is to get the work that you've been doing in front of the voters. It's also, by the way, almost certainly one of the best ways of getting it in front of ministers and policymakers. Because if it's on the front page of the Times or on the BBC News, then ministers and policymakers will see it and are much more likely to question it or to respond to it than if it comes to them in almost any other way. So that is really important from that point of view, and we build up that relationship over time by doing all the things that we've described, and it is quite resource intensive. I mean, it really is quite resource intensive, and I mean, coming back to the previous question, I think it's one of the reasons why it's quite difficult in a sort of if your main job is in an academic department, it's a lot of work, and actually we put that work in. In terms of your second question on the sort of complexity, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's again, journalists are very often looking for yes and no, black and white answers, and some of the sort of biggest risks that we face are when and that's actually if I'm being interviewed live, that's absolutely fine because I'm in control of what I'm saying, and I can say on the one hand, on the other, we're uncertain about this and so on. If I'm being interviewed pre-recorded, and they'll get me to say both things, it does sometimes go out in ways that I'm not happy with because it'll end up making it look more definite than it is, and you have to take judgment on that. It's not impossible to get complexity discussed in the media. Obviously not in terms of this regression says that or this regression says the other, but in terms of there are trade-offs, there's uncertainties, and so on. But it's harder than where it's kind of nailed on.
So on our experience, this has been a very hard part of the job to try to communicate through the press. I think at first, given the lack of resources, we concentrate on producing the research and then publishing it, and then we look. Le Monde takes it, Figaro. We didn't do much. realize that by not doing much, sometimes it ends up well, sometimes it's misinterpreted, sometimes. So we need to interact more with journalists, trying to dedicate more time and therefore more resources to do that. And basically, I think we've got better over time, but we're still lagging way behind what IFS is doing in terms of interacting with journalists. We don't have resources today to respond to all. So I'm invited on BFM every day. I don't go. I don't have the time. Literally, I need to run the Institute, do all my stuff as an academic at PSE. I mean, I can't do that. It'll be better if sometimes I was doing it more, trying to bring the viewpoint of the Institute, trying to give more out loud what we know, what we don't know. I think, but we have to be realistic about how much resources we put into that, the interactions with the media and how to do it. I think we have also a wide margin of improvement in terms of to train our staff, as IFS is training its staff for media training, how to talk to journalists, how to communicate in a sort of short way, because at the end it will be cut. You have to say the one sentence which summarize in a very good way the research, and that will be cut and produced and put live. The other thing is that by interacting more often, and we do that more often now, to having a press conference where before the publications we have presentation of the work, where we can have many journalists in the same room and therefore spend 1 hour explaining exactly what we did. Then it leads to much better sort of papers or news outlets because they have fully understood what we wanted to say, and then it's much better quality. So today, I think we concentrate on what I would say the top quality type of media outlets. Also, Le Monde, trying to find Le Déco, the top, written press that actually have really good quality sort of papers out of the research we do. We do radio because it can be also good quality with type of, longer sort of talk show where you have time to explain what we know, what we don't know, and the debate's fine. We do a lot less TV because that's very time consuming. And although you get huge exposure, at the end, I always feel that how much information is really conveyed sometimes can be relatively poor given the time we dedicated to it.
Those are good questions, important ones. Do we have any other questions? In which case, I'll just ask you one question to wrap us up. Looking at the next 2-3 years, you're going to have to give some pretty disappointing analyses. When you look at the interest rates, debt, what's happening, climate change, all of these things, you're going to have to deliver some pretty horrible news. Do you think it will change the way in which your institutes are seen, or the way in which your job works, or the way in which you have to approach it to do that? Or do you just use the same playbook as before?
Look, we're not known for being cheerful anyway, so that won't be...
Yeah, you say that again. Yeah, actually.
In a sense, it won't be.
I can't remember the last time you said this is really good news. Yeah.
But look, I mean, the big challenge for us over the next 18 months is there's going to be a general election in the UK. Mm-hmm. And we're going to approach that, I think, by trying to set some of the context for it by pointing out where we are with the public finances, what's happening with growth, the constraints on what a new government is going to be able to do, given that we are moving to highest levels of tax we've had ever, but very, very high levels of debt interest payments, and plans from the current government really that look like cutting public spending over the next few years. So there's some very difficult circles to square there. There's obviously demographic change, which is having a big impact on what we're spending on health and pensions in particular. And there are big challenges around social care, big challenges you mentioned around climate change, where the Climate Change Committee, which I was a member of until last month, has reported today saying that essentially there's nowhere near the policy in place that is needed to meet the net zero targets, and so on and so on. So part of what we'll be doing over the next period will be trying to set that context And then we will be doing quite a lot of work reacting to policy proposals that come out of government and opposition. And just as we were saying earlier, we'll be reacting to those policies off the back of the expertise and research and institutional knowledge and so on that we have, in a way that hopefully we can do that in a constructive manner, in a way that's informing people, and in a way that is timely enough that it is part of the political debate as and when it arises.
I say good luck to you with that. But yeah, Antoine.
So on IPP, unfortunately, we don't do analysis of platforms before elections. Unfortunately, because I think I would love to do it, but we decided at the last election that we were not ready enough. We didn't have enough materials to be able to do that in a very impartial, comprehensive way. And therefore, we said we won't enter that. But I'd like to imagine a time when IPP would be able to do that, that is to provide analysis of platforms before election, try to look at the potential impacts of different policy proposals. I think it would be extremely useful for the French policy debate. We're not there yet, I hope one day. So for us, in terms of sort of objective, in terms of policy themes of research we think will be crucial, will be environmental policy, will require a lot of investment, will lot cost that be shared among households. And we have seen recently with the yellow vest movement in France, you may have seen on British TV, some burning of, even though it's common in France, when there was a big sort of riots at the time for the planned increase of the carbon tax. I think there's clearly a huge element of analysis of how to have environmental policies that reach these climate objectives in a way that sort of also take into account the large heterogeneity and inequality among households in how they might be affected, both by direct impact of climate change and by the policies that will be put in place. The other policy area where we really think we'll want to do more work on is skills, education, and training. There'll be a huge need for training of workers who work now in industries that will need to change. They used to build, diesel, motors, battery, and they need to switch to electric batteries or things like that. But a whole range of industry will need to adapt, and therefore there'll need to be trainings of these workers. And we need to think, how you design very effective training skills for different groups of people. And I think this is an area where we still need to do a lot more. And I'm saying that, but also, our main aim is basically still to look at IFS and try to see how we can try to emulate, again, even better the model that IFS was and is today.
Well, we better let you start getting on with it, because that is a serious amount of work. And also, seriously, as someone who is a sort of consumer of what you provide, as well as sort of like an observer of what you provide as well, it's so easy to underestimate the value of what it is, because how much worse would the public debate be about finances if you weren't around? So I think thanks very much, Paul. Thanks, Antoine. Thanks for talking to us today. And, we'll be seeing more of you on TV and radio. So thank you, guys.